Linda.
Governor, good morning, Linda Gillette with the Coalition. We're so happy you're here.
I'm glad to be here. Just over
Well, you're
here.
in the second
This
seat,
is the
right
hot
there.
seat.
That's the hot seat, that's right.
How do you do, Natalie? Good morning. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Yeah, that's me.
That's you. Welcome
Thank
to
you.
rainy New Hampshire.
Catch
But
my
I
breath.
see you have the right footwear,
I
so
do
you
have
are
the
well
right footwear.
prepared
Yes,
for the
yes.
next couple days.
No, I know this. I know this part of the world, and I know that the weather can change suddenly,
That's right.
politically and otherwise.
Otherwise, euphemistically and literally. So, well, Governor Patrick, thank you. Yes, I knew you'd see some familiar faces here today. So thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation, which is part of our bipartisan, first in the nation conversation with candidates about crime victim rights.
Yeah.
We know that in your role as governor of Massachusetts that you spearheaded some really influential initiatives to impact how states and communities responded to victims of sexual assault and domestic violence. And we'd love to have a chance to hear about some of those today, and also hear about how you see that translating onto the national stage should you be elected president. Here at the Coalition, we are an umbrella organization for 13 community-based crisis centers.
Yeah, Amanda was telling me that.
That's
on the way
right,
out.
yeah. Each year we serve about 15,000 survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, human trafficking, dating violence. All of those services are free and confidential. All of our programs have 24-hour hotlines. They all respond to the hospitals in their communities 24 hours a day. You're going to hear a little bit about that from one of our programs today. They all engage in prevention education in their communities and provide a wide range of supportive services to individual survivors. You're also going to hear a little bit about our economic empowerment and housing work today. Here at the statewide office, we manage a number of programs. We house the Sexual Assault Nurse Examiner program.
Okay.
So we work with nurses and hospitals around the state to ensure that the medical providers who are responding to victims have the highest level of training and are prepared to respond both to the emotional trauma that survivors have experienced, but also to adequately collect the forensic evidence that is needed.
Yep.
We provide a lot of trauma-informed services and training. You're going to hear about that from Linda. And this time of year, we spend a lot of time across the street at the State House advocating for public policies that support survivors.
Who are your champions in the legislature?
So we have champions on both sides of the aisle. I
Yep.
mean, one of the things that's fantastic about doing anti-violence work is it is not partisan. We absolutely need allies at all levels in the State House, in the leadership. As you know, we have this extraordinarily large House, which is news to some of the candidates who come here. So our policy work is very dependent on building a lot of relationships, and our member programs need to build those relationships, and they do an amazing job educating their legislators, because it's hard for us to get to all 400 people. But we have champions in the legislature, we have a champion in our attorney general, we have a champion in our governor, and it's important working with all of those folks. So so it's exciting, and we're thrilled to have this opportunity to have you join us today. I'd love to tell you who the panelists are who will be with us, and then turn it over to you for some welcoming comments, if that works. So to my left is Linda Douglas. Linda is our trauma-informed services specialist here at the Coalition, and she's going to share with you about some of her work working with systems to help them respond most effectively to victims of sexual assault and domestic violence. And to your immediate right is Amanda Mace. Amanda is the program director at Turning Points Networks, one of the member programs of the Coalition. And next to her is Natalie Rickman. Natalie's the manager of our AmeriCorps Victim Assistance Program and is incredibly knowledgeable about service and also the economic empowerment work that the members do each year.
Great.
So with that, I'll say welcome and turn it over to you.
Thank you.
Minutes.
Thank you
Thanks
very, very much. And thank you, everybody, for your patience in my coming late. No disrespect intended. I'm going to keep my comments very, very brief so we can spend most of our time in conversation. And I'm looking to the folks who are not at the panel as well, because I hope you get drawn in as well. If you're like other advocates in this space, and I know you don't need to be invited twice. You probably don't even need to be invited. So I want to tell you a little bit about some of the things that we did when I was in office as governor. It sounds like you may know about some of them, and then maybe make it a little bit more personal. When I was in office, I came in just as the bottom fell out of the global economy, and as is often the case when economic conditions deteriorate, sexual assault and domestic violence escalates. I don't know if you've experienced that here in New Hampshire, but it's what we were seeing spiking in Massachusetts. So the first thing I did was to declare a public health advisory, because this is a public health issue in many. It's a criminal justice issue, an economic issue as well. We reconvened and reformed what's called the Governor's Council on Sexual Abuse and Domestic Violence, and we populated it with people who would actually were experts in the field, and with their help, developed a set of legislative proposals to kind of close some of the gaps that we began to see in the network of services to respond. And I'll just mention a couple of things that were in that legislation, which we did pass and sign. We protected employment leave, so that as victims or survivors were having to step away from work in order to look after themselves, their job would be there at the other end. There are big issues around confidentiality of police reports. So when you go to make the report, but there are reasons why, in a whole host of circumstances, the complainant needed to have that report kept confidential until it was time to use it in a court of law or for lesson or for particular needs. We imposed a right to terminate a lease. Bless you. I know exactly how you feel. the numbers of people who were in, and I say people because it was more often than not women, but it wasn't always women who were in leases with someone who was abusing them. They needed to get out of that relationship, but they were sometimes tied to that legal obligation, and we made it a right to be able to terminate that lease and step away. Again, this is not all of the response to the point about the economic impact of abuse. Not all of the response, but it was one of the ways of acknowledging that you got to be able to get your economic independence as a part of getting out of a dangerous or abusive situation. And then we mandated training for police and for court personnel, for the DAs and so on, because you would hear again and again from survivors about how they felt victimized all over again in some of the interactions they had with officials. These are some of the elements in the legislation. Again, we took the council from the council and their outreach to other organizations, response organizations, and to survivors as well. And we took a lot of guidance from my wife, who was herself a survivor in her first marriage. I met Diane. Amy knows this, but I met Diane in Los Angeles in 1982. Yes, in 1982, and she was coming out the third time from her marriage then of 7 years. A person she'd met in New York, where she grew up, and who took her to. They moved out to California, and she said, she's come to realize that the isolation of the it's a pattern in abusers, and she was married. She dated him for a little while in New York. She was married for 7 years. She went to law school there in LA and started working in a law firm, and so much shame, she was so secretive about it. No one in the firm knew for most of this time, but I guess the worst of it was holding a gun to her head and telling her that if she ever left him again, after the second time, that he would kill her and whomever it is she was leaving him for, as if she had to leave him for someone. So when I didn't know this when I was first getting to know her, we were there's a whole other story about how we were set up, and by someone who knew her one colleague at work and from law school, who knew about her situation and had been encouraging her to separate for the last and final time. Her parents didn't know what was going on. Her family didn't know what was going on. Again, I now understand this to be a pattern of behavior. And she and this friend set us up and said, he's only here for a year because he's clerking for a judge, and then he's going off again. And she kept saying, look, I want to be out of this relationship, and I don't want to be in another one. But we got to know each other, and she tells the story that as we were getting to know each other, the fact that I didn't run away, that I didn't think this, she was, these are her terms, I would never use them, but damaged goods. And in fact, I think through that process, not only did we, not only did we fall in love, but we became, we've been married 35 years now. And she's found her voice so that, and this is more than you want to hear, but she's a very private person. Yeah, I wish you were here.
We had hoped that we were going to see
Yeah, I know,
you
you
right
didn't
now.
actually want me.
No.
I understand.
I didn't say that exactly.
No, I mean, she's a remarkable person. She was a reluctant first lady. She's also managed anxiety and depression for most of her adult life. And she was a brilliant first lady, but she was a reluctant one. And I remember when I smile about it, but in the early days, we had a really bumpy start. And she ended up in the hospital, and I remember sitting with her and talking about whether I should resign. I'd only been in office for a couple of months. And she, she reflected on it, and I said, you know what, you were proud I won, but you were hoping I would lose. She said, how did you know? I said, look, we've known each other and are getting to know each other deeper and deeper over all those years. She ultimately began to speak about both her mental illness, managing her mental illness, and the domestic abuse that she had experienced. And that is where her leadership emerged. Because the permission given by a person of her prominence to be able to talk about these issues, first of all, in terms of the mental health, that she got thousands and thousands of messages and cards and so forth from people saying, if you can talk about it and get help, maybe I can talk about it and go get help. And she's still getting notes from people saying, you saved my life. On the domestic abuse, we would go out to dinner on rare occasions, and she'd step away and to go to the ladies' room. Someone would follow her into the ladies' room because it was safe. And she would carry these cards from Jane Doe, which is one of the, and someone would say, I wish she were here, because to hear her talk about this, would open their mouths and just say, I, and then she would just hand them the card with the phone number and say, there is help, go get it. And so I think she's not a reluctant First Lady wannabe this time. She is all in. She just couldn't be here this morning because of other conflicts. But she wants this platform for this work. And there is nothing like, I think, and there are a couple of other issues of this kind that come to mind, giving people permission to come out of the shadows and feel like it's safe to, in fact, it has to be safe, which is the other part of it. You have to have all of you have to be supported, and your counterparts in different parts of the country. But to make it okay, to call what's not okay what it is. And my sister, in her own other set of complicated ways, has been managing through these issues as well. So I don't know all I need to know, but I guess what I'm trying to say is I've been learning from my wife and from many allies how to be a leader in this space, and I think I've been a pretty darn good one as a result. So I'll stop.
Well, thank you, and I hope you'll send Mrs. Patrick our best,
I will do.
because we are so appreciative of how she has been an effective voice, and I think what you're showing in this conversation today is something that we certainly embrace as a movement and as an organization, which is we all need to talk about this to take away that shame, to take away the stigma that gets put on survivors who are children, survivors who are adults, domestic violence, sexual assault, it doesn't matter. We absolutely as a community should be stepping up and having these conversations.
You know, we used to we had I forget which day it was, but there was a day in particular where we called attention to sexual assault and domestic violence. And one of the things that we had as a practice was that I would go to schools and talk to young men about what it means to be a man, and what it doesn't mean to be a man. And again, it's not. This is not to say that that's a substitute for closing legislative and legal gaps and creating infrastructure, but there is a leadership piece here, which is an opportunity. It's just different with the kind of pulpit you have as a governor that I'm trying to have as a president. So you should. I just want to make sure you understand that I understand that, and intend to use it that way.
Thank you. Well, I think you brought up several examples, which will be a wonderful segue into talking to Amanda. So Amanda, we'd love to hear a little bit about your work at Turning Points Network, and also the work that you do with survivors and with their children, both in terms of responding to emergency needs, but also the focus that you really have on long-term, how to help folks achieve the kind of independence that Governor Patrick was talking about.
Yes, thank you. And thank you again, as Lynn said, for sharing her story, because as you were speaking, I could really think about all the survivors that I work with every day, and it really, what you were saying really rings true with so many different stories of so many people that we work with. So, to speak to the immediate needs piece, every survivor that comes into our doors needs something a little bit different. So it's like 5 survivors would come in with 5 very similar stories, and they would leave with 5 different outcomes, because part of an advocate's job is to be able to sit down with the survivor, offer a listening ear, and be able to navigate and discover all of the resources that are available, and be able to help that survivor choose what's best for them. So a big key piece of the work that we do is we work off the empowerment model, which really means it's our responsibility to find that information and then help best guide each survivor. So with some survivors, if, for example, they've been sexually assaulted, they would present at the hospital and they would go to a SANE nurse, for example. An advocate's role would be there for 4, 6, 7 hours, just supporting that survivor with whatever they need. So sometimes that is being there all night into the early morning hours, and then sometimes it's checking with the survivor, letting them know that we're available if they don't want us there, and then we can follow up with them the next step. But again, every survivor, when they present at the hospital, or if we meet with them and then go to the hospital, it will look a little bit different. We also provide court advocacy, which means anytime somebody needs assistance with parenting plans or divorce plans or an ex parte, we can go to the court and we can help them, again, navigate that huge process, especially if it's somebody who's not familiar with the court systems or who's never walked into the court before, and they're walking in.
Most people.
And I know, and it can be absolutely terrifying, and it's terrifying to know that you feel your child's in danger, and you have to get somebody else's permission. You can't just take your child and leave. So all of those, everything, when you're a survivor and when you're in that kind of situation, you don't know what you have to do, it's absolutely terrifying. So it's really, I consider it a very special job. I love my job. I love to be able to support survivors, and as long as it's legal, we're able to do it. So, so that's what really is. There's no limit to the services that we're able to provide a survivor, as long as we have the funds to be able to do so. But I've assisted people, getting them on planes, helping them move to Washington and to Florida, and they wouldn't be able to do that without the funding streams that we've received from the coalition, which is so incredibly important.
So talk about, is it all right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, please do.
Talk about the funding streams.
Yes, so the coalition, as Lynn said, is our umbrella agency. So Turning Points receives some funding, just like the other 12 member programs. So they receive the funding streams through the coalition. So for example, one of the funding streams is Joshua's Law, or Housing First.
Okay.
When a survivor presents and one of the things they need is, or they left in the middle of the night with just a backpack and
Yep.
just shoved whatever they could in the backpack,
Yeah.
they may not have a social security card, they may not have a birth certificate. That Joshua's Law funding stream that I received from the coalition is able to pay for those things. We're able to pay for that birth certificate, we're able to pay for that social security card, whatever they need. The funding streams are also Housing First, for as an example. So with that Housing First money, we're able to pay somebody's security deposit, first month's rent, and then assist with some months after.
Okay.
So I'm gonna talk about housing as a long-term goal. But those funding streams are just so incredibly instrumental. So we can do some of our own fundraising in the Sullivan County where I'm located.
Okay.
But without the funding stream from the coalition, we would not be able to do nearly as much as we're
And the
able to.
coalition's funding is?
So we administer all the state and federal funds for the
Okay.
crisis centers. So in terms of a federal level, because we want this to be on every candidate's radar, there are three primary federal sources. The Victims of Crime Act, VOCA, is the largest one. Funds through the Violence Against Women Act, there's a few different funds through that. And then the Family Violence Prevention Services Act, often referred to as FIPSA, is often directed toward domestic violence and shelter. So we contract, the federal government contracts with state agencies, the coalition receives the funds, and then we use a formula that's approved by our board of directors to distribute the funds to the individual crisis centers.
Okay. Do you have the capacity you need? I'm gonna come to whether
Yeah.
the funding is enough, but I mean, just the people to respond to
We have a great deal of support here at
Yeah.
the coalition, so
Yeah.
if we have questions or if we feel that there's a direction that we want to go in, we can certainly reach out to the coalition, and our support here is instrumental in our work. As far as capacity for direct services advocates, I mean, I don't think so. We could really use, we served, just for example, in our Sullivan County, 2 bigger towns in Sullivan County, a lot of smaller towns. We served over 900 survivors just last year.
Wow.
That's not a survivor that comes in 4 times to seek services. We're not counting that survivor 4 times. That's over 900 survivors. So when we assist them with the immediate needs, but also the long-term needs in the hospital and the court and the crisis line calls, whatever that survivor needs. So no, to answer that boldly and honestly, no. And also a huge part of the work that we do, unfortunately, we serve those bigger 2 towns in Claremont and Newport. We want to reach every single survivor in the outlying towns in the Sullivan County. So in order to do that, we need more prevention funds. We have a roving advocate for the first time this year, which is wonderful, through our integrated delivery network. But I really want to be able to send an advocate out to those little small towns like Akron and Langdon and I'm sorry, you guys probably don't know where those little towns are, but they're little towns in Sullivan County. And we really want, and I want that statewide, not just for Sullivan County. I want every single survivor in New Hampshire that needs assistance to be able to have the access to transportation to seek services, to be aware of our services, to know what to call, and to be able to get the help that they need. And that's statewide, I really want that.
Do you find, or others, that the issues are the same or different as you get to more rural communities?
Very similar. It's a good question. I think it's very similar. I think the challenges are the same. Statewide, I feel the court navigation systems, the hospital advocacy, it's all the same. But when it comes to certain, I think court districts are a little bit different. I feel that the judges aren't consistent across the state. So I'd like to think that the 2 in Sullivan County where I am, but I will know that if I'm assisting a survivor that goes to our Newport court, they're gonna get a different response than they will for Claremont. So I think, it is.
That's why that's why the training piece was in the legislation, because we were seeing the same thing. Thank you.
Of course. So as far as accessing long-term needs, the biggest needs that survivors need right now are access to safe, affordable housing. We're in a housing crisis in New Hampshire. So 5 years ago, we used to be able to help a survivor get into an apartment in more of maybe a rundown, it was still safe, but maybe let's just say a more rundown apartment building. We could get a 1-bedroom or studio apartment for $450 or $500 a month. Fast forward 5 years to today, that same apartment in that same rundown building is looking like $900,000 a month. That's unreasonable. And survivors should never stay in a domestic violence relationship because they can't afford to leave. And that is the reality. And that is a lot of the work that we are doing at our crisis centers, is we are doing that financial empowerment and building on those wonderful resources that we get from the coalition and from Natalie's Health. We're being able to train survivors so that they know what they can do on their own, but also to give them some of the funding streams to help them. Because if we pay rent for somebody for 4 months, even if they could afford it, that's still giving them the money that they can invest into the match savings program, or they can save it, or they can pay down their hospital bills, or so even if somebody has $1,000 in their pocket and their rent's $900, we're still going to try to cover that for a few months if we can to get them the boost up.
And is that with a plan to help them launch
Yes.
after the 4 months? So it's not, they don't just go off a cliff.
Absolutely. And the way our housing, we have a separate transitional housing grant at our crisis center. And the way that it works is it's a taper down model. So every month we'll pay security, we'll pay a first month's rent. We'll pay a little bit less each month. The survivor will pay a little bit more. And what that does is it helps them build their rent into their budget, into their, so they're planning on it. But if we were to pay their rent for a full year, then they're just gonna build that into their budget. And then unfortunately at the end of the year, it's gonna be much harder for them to make that transition. So safe, affordable housing is key for survivors. There's a tremendous lack for it, but also
Across the board.
Completely. And also it's the transportation. So there are so many survivors that we work with that just can't access the things that they need, such as employment. So I don't know what the big answer to that. I'm not asking you to try to get us a bunch of cars, but that would be. But the streamlined services across New Hampshire would be tremendous. So, and I know our local transportation agency is working very hard to try to get bus systems up to the Upper Valley, for example, where we are up in the Lebanon, Hanover area. They're working hard, but there's just not enough funds for it. So, and, sorry, just, can I say?
No, you're good, yeah.
Keep going, girl.
Mental health services, access to mental health. So one of our key programs or turning points is our family violence prevention specialist. She is a liaison between our agency and DCYF, so she spends about 20 hours a week with referrals from DCYF. She also is the advocate that attends our Child Advocacy Center. So at the Child Advocacy Center is a place where children are interviewed if they've been sexually assaulted or abused. I can't tell you how frustrating it is to have the advocate there supporting the non-offending parent and saying, I hear that you'd like to get your child enrolled in mental health, to meet with somebody, but the waiting list is 6 months. So we try to be a Band-Aid as best we can. We'll meet with that parent. Unfortunately, we don't have the funds for a child advocate at our center. We need a child advocate, but we used to, but unfortunately funding's ended, so we don't. But we try to be, like I said, a Band-Aid to really meet with that family and offer that peer support counseling, but without, we are not mental health clinicians, so it's really difficult to just say to someone, I know you need this, but unfortunately it's not available. So there's just a huge need for that across the state. So other referrals is a big part of what we do. Again, it's our job to make sure that we have all of the resources and we're able to share that with the survivor, but they choose their own path. So we offer peer support counseling every day, and we call it peer support counseling because domestic violence, as you know, doesn't discriminate. It could happen to anybody at any time. So when we're offering peer support counseling, I could be meeting with Natalie, and I'm no different than Natalie. So I'm going to share all of the resources and all of the information, and really I'm going to partner with Natalie to help Natalie, if you don't mind using this example. But Natalie will decide ultimately what is best for her. It's not what I think is best for Natalie because she's a survivor of domestic violence and she came in with a black eye. It's not up to me to tell Natalie she's going to come into our shelter. It's up to me to tell Natalie that our shelter is an option for her should she choose to come to our shelter. But here are also the other housing options and the other court options and the other everything that is available to her.
But being able to speak from your own experience is a powerful side.
It really is. So, and another question. I could go on for
I
hours.
know, thank you, Amanda. So I bet we'll come back with some more questions. So that's a great segue to Natalie, who managed the AmeriCorps Victim Assistance Program, which has done some extraordinary work in the last few years around financial literacy and creating financial resources for survivors and also training the volunteer AmeriCorps members to do that direct service. So I'd love for you to talk about that, Natalie.
Yeah, thank you. So before I speak to the economic empowerment programming that we have here, I'd just like to briefly give a little bit of context for why we felt moving in that direction was so important. So we've known anecdotally through our work with survivors that economic abuse is incredibly prevalent. And the research has confirming that about 98% of domestic violence cases, there are economic abuse tactics being utilized.
As a part of the control.
Yes, yeah. So financial abuse, it's a broad spectrum. It looks a little bit different, but examples of this could include restricting access to a paycheck or other benefits like SNAP benefits, and so controlling the family's resources. It could be sabotaging someone's employment, so showing up to their place of employment, so trying to keep a partner out of being gainfully employed. It could be taking out a line of credit in a partner's name without their consent or knowledge. Sometimes with the aim to lower a credit score, so maybe getting an auto loan or a rental application in the future.
You mean purposefully to hurt
Yes.
someone's credit score?
Yes, because then if somebody's credit score is low and they can't, their rental application for an apartment to try to leave a situation isn't as good because the credit is low, that's another means to keep
That's
somebody.
one I had not heard, the others I have.
Yeah, so economic abuse is a very broad spectrum, so we knew we wanted to address it and that our services needed to try to be equally as broad. And we know that economic abuse doesn't happen in a vacuum over here, it's very much happening within the context of abuse, so we really needed to try to be intentional and integrate it into our advocacy services that we already offer. And so one of those ways is the program that I manage, have the honor of managing, the AmeriCorps Victim Assistance Program. We've been around since '94, and in the beginning we had a really strong court focus. And although our advocates still do provide that court advocacy, there's really been a shift toward providing the members with specific training around financial literacy services. And so the types of services that they're doing one-on-one sessions with survivors based on survivor identified needs, so that could be budgeting, that could be credit repair, all the way to if a survivor is in a place of wanting to potentially become a homeowner, getting them information related to that. So it's that one-on-one support, but they're also going out and doing workshops. So that could be at the crisis center, or that could be partnering with a community institution, so kind of broadening our scope, trying to do outreach to community members that we may not be reaching through the crisis center. And we also have AmeriCorps members based at police offices and prosecutors' office, so their role looks a little bit different, but they're helping victim survivors sign up for maybe victims compensation and having them understand restitution and connecting them with the crisis center to get those other financial literacy services. And
they're in court just inserting themselves, is what you're saying, when the AmeriCorps volunteers who are in courts, are they part of the DA's team, or are they just kind of moving around and watching the docket?
Their role would be most similar to like a victim witness advocate. So they're reaching out to victims and keeping them apprised of the cases.
They have an official role.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a really cool partnership that we have here in New Hampshire. And to give you just an idea nationally of what AmeriCorps and this work looks like, there's only one other state, Kentucky, that has an AmeriCorps program that focuses on working with survivors with this economic empowerment lens. And so another thing that our AmeriCorps members do, and Amanda mentioned this, is working with our awesome Housing First advocates. And those Housing First advocates are doing amazing work, both direct service with survivors, helping them with rental applications and identifying what kind of housing they qualify for. But they're also doing broader level work out in the community, doing landlord engagement and forming relationships with the local housing authority. Really trying to raise that awareness of this is an issue we should all care about, and here are the benefits of renting to survivors. And so those are two programs that we're really proud of, and that we've been able to place those advocates at our member programs doing those services. But we also recognize that in addition to these amazing services, we also need to have tangible tools. And so Amanda mentioned this, the Match Savings Program is a partnership that we have with the Bank of New Hampshire, and that is a tangible tool that we can offer to survivors. It's meant to encourage the development of savings habits, and so a survivor selects the tier that they would like to participate at, and then if they successfully meet their match, we then match that 1-to-1. So that can be awesome for security deposits, a fix on their vehicle that they may be needing. It's just a little bump that's really helpful. So yeah, and in Housing First, New Hampshire is one of 4 states who have a program like that. So we hope more states will continue to adopt that model.
I think we're one of the 4. Please don't say we're not. I think Massachusetts is. No?
I'd have to get back with you. So it's just our hope that we're going to continue to expand these economic justice programming based on survivor identified need that just offer pathways for healing, safety, and independence, and also raise awareness that, as you mentioned, this isn't just a social or public health issue, but it's an economic issue.
Thank you. Thank you. I was thinking as you were speaking, and also Amanda, and some of your comments. How do you think about prevention? You know, it's interesting how we pay attention, if at all, once in crisis. But you know, how do you think about financial literacy? You know, savings habits. The sort of habits of independence before there's crisis, or is there just not is the network not really set up for that? And that, I don't mean that as a critique, but I'm just it's true in so many. I mean, the affordable housing crisis, for example, is a crisis whether you are a survivor or not, here and in a lot of places. So I don't mean to diminish I'm also just thinking if I am in a relationship where I feel trapped, how do I learn before crisis that I don't have to be trapped? Or do you understand what I'm saying? Or does it, you just have to get to that point before you can avail yourself of the kinds of responses and rescues that you guys have been working so hard on?
Yeah. To speak specifically to the financial literacy piece, getting that early, there is a bill before our House right now about incorporating financial literacy skills in K-12 education. It's currently going through committee. I think there's concerns about how that would look like at the local control level, getting schools to engage and buy in and keeping that consistent among schools. So that's certainly something that I think is desired by some here and is working itself out.
And I think when we think about the broader issue of prevention, Governor, it's the area that we see that is the most underfunded of all the work that we do. I think the crisis centers do a phenomenal job. As a movement, we do a phenomenal job responding to crisis, responding to the person who has immediate needs. The amount of money that we administer to the member programs to do prevention work funds one part of one very low paid staff person. So the crisis centers have to go out and raise the funds just to fill a single position for someone who's out doing age appropriate prevention education, which can start at the beginning of elementary school. Learning to develop respectful, healthy relationships. It's never too soon to start that. It's never too soon to start that messaging. And the crisis centers are very good at it, but they have very few resources to do it.
You know, not that this is a nonpartisan issue, but is there an impact on your work to the point about learning respectful relationships of the behavior of the incumbent president?
There is no question that communities look to people in elected office, and we have an expectation that people in elected office will be role models. There is no question, and this has come up a lot in the conversations that we're having preparing for the election, because our electorate is made up of survivors. This room is made up of survivors. Survivors listen and pay attention, and the conduct of our elected officials is important and does make a difference and does set a tone for children and for adults. So that's why we have to be having those conversations. And so when you asked, I was going to circle back to it, and I do want to turn to Linda, but when you asked about the federal funding streams, most of those streams that we talked about before are geared toward either the criminal justice system or toward housing. But the tiny bit of money that we get through public health that is designated toward prevention is barely a drop in the bucket for what we need to do to start those conversations early so that we're not having the conversations 30 years later when someone is in elected office. So the people feel the tenor. There's no question. There's no question. So I know I'm just looking for why or somebody. How are we doing on time? Right? We're doing great. Okay, wonderful.
Yeah, is everybody okay?
Praise God. I know there's some questions out there in the audience too. So I want to take a few minutes and turn to Linda just to talk a little bit about how your work has evolved, helping systems respond in a more trauma-informed way, and what you see is the most important. And I'm hoping you're going to talk about kids in capes a little bit.
Oh, okay, I'll get there. So, about 12 years ago, the coalition here was recognizing that there was a need to enhance services to women and children who had been impacted by mental illness and substance use, and decided to go ahead and create the position that I'm in now in order to be able to provide technical assistance and training to our programs in the state. This was under the umbrella of Trauma-Informed Services. We were fortunate to get a grant from FIPSA, the Family Violence Prevention Services Act, and also received some technical assistance from a program out of Chicago. And actually, I was the first person in the country to be in a position like this that could be able to work with the programs on providing this service.
It's that first in the nation thing again.
There we are. There we are.
We're not shy.
Yeah. And the piece that was really critical at that time, that had been a part of my career before then, was understanding that for a long time our programs were not assisting particularly women who were impacted by substance use disorder, because they just weren't recognizing that men who batter really liked it when their partners were addicted to substances and would either coerce them to use or encourage them to use, and were using that against them. But programs were not willing to take people into shelter who were actively using. Over the past 10, 11 years, I'm proud to say that our programs have changed. They have that philosophy now of we will take you no matter what's going on so that we can help you. If you make a decision that you want to get clean and sober, we will work with you on trying to find the places that you can do that. If you still choose to use, we will safety plan with you about how you can do that safely. It was just becoming really important because we understood too that people were self-medicating because of childhood trauma and all of those things. So that has been a big part of what I've done, and then that evolved into providing training and technical assistance to a number of other programs, collaborators in the state, including police, law enforcement, DHHS, the Department of Children, Youth and Families. It's evolved into talking to educators at a number of schools in the state about the effects of trauma on children. I talk to mediators. There's just anybody who calls and says, Linda, will you come in and talk particularly about adverse childhood experiences and trauma as it relates to domestic violence and sexual assault? Can you do that? And I'm like, sure, I will be there. So it's primarily what I'm doing now, in addition to providing technical assistance to our member programs. The superheroes, the CAPE thing, came about a few years ago when I was asked to present on trauma to a group of at-risk teenagers. And I was concerned because I didn't want to go into this group and talk about adverse childhood experiences and trauma and open these kids up to being triggered around their own childhood trauma, because I knew that this was probably a population that had experienced some child abuse and had been exposed to a number of things. So I happen to be a big fan of the Avengers. So
Put that right out there, didn't you?
Yeah, it's, and so I came up with a training program where I can go in and talk to kids and their parents, and taking a look at how superheroes, their origin stories always contain trauma, and how they grew up and took and had this power that they could make a choice of whether or not they were going to use that power for good or for evil. And our superheroes that manage to use it for good are those who had a strong, loving caretaker in their lives. And parents love to hear that part of it.
Yeah.
And that's how they become resilient, and that's how they get their cape, is because of that resilient person. And most of the kids that I talk to, what's really fun is there's always one teen or child in that room who is an expert on some superhero. So it may not necessarily be one that I'm familiar with, because there's one that Hugh Jackman plays that there's a lot of kids that are really into that one that I'm not quite, but because he's a DC and I'm I'm geeking out on you here, but but the kids really, they're able to
They understand
get into that and without so much taking a look at themselves, but then able to sit back and say, you know, because I remind them that even though our superheroes are not real, they are, the emotions that they feel are very human emotions. And they start thinking about the things that they can do in order to be able to manage their own trauma and be able to be more resilient.
I love that.
So it's my favorite thing to do. Yeah, it is, because it's just one way.
It's also not, I mean, I was gonna say it's not at all contrived. It is kind of contrived, but it is actually the way it is.
Yeah.
It is actually what the experience of managing through trauma is, and particularly the caretaker. I'm thinking of this quite personally right now, but you know, not necessarily the trauma that you're. But we're all broken in one way or another.
And it takes one person that really cares about us. But what's really cool is that when I talk to these groups, I'll usually have, you know, particularly the younger ones who are in 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade. There'll be a 9-year-old or 10-year-old in the group, and I'll start off and I'll say, why do you think the kids at school who bully, why do you think they bully? And the answer I always get is, because there's things happening to them at home. And I'm like, at 9 years old, they get it. And they understand why this is happening. So it's so important for kids to hear about this information so that they can look towards the people who will help them become resilient. It's important for parents to hear this information, because then they know the things that they can help put in their children's life. I even talked to men at our state prison about this. I did it last week. I did my presentation on superheroes, because I say, when you have a chance to talk to your kids, find out who their favorite superhero is. Learn about that origin story and talk about how that works for them. So it's my favorite thing to do.
It's amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. So thank you to all of the panelists. If we have a little bit more time, are you open to some comments?
Get it together.
It's okay. This is what we do, and these are hard topics, and I think they resonate with everybody. So that's we do this work in community.
I'm actually tough enough to be president.
I would much rather have a president who is touched by talking about children and trauma than one who isn't. Let's be really clear about that. So.
You know, it's just politically. Yeah, actually, if we could put it over that recording thing. We are you know, as a nation bullied right now, and I've talked about this some politically, publicly. I was bullied when I was 7. In the 7th grade, and I recognize that you know, we sort of swing from rage to resignation and back again. We're going to get even or just get over. And you know, we're going to have to figure out how to get bigger. Just, you know, outgrow that. Just and the way you talk to the children that you talk to is just it's such a marvelous and accessible and deeply true way of talking about how you surmount the trauma. It does take acts of kindness by
Yes.
people who say, who make a decision that we are better, and that victim is better.
Yes.
It's sort of the case I've been trying to make to the electorate, that we are in fact better than that we don't have to be this. Yeah.
Exactly.
Anyway,
And that there are roles for all of us to play as bystanders.
That's
in
right.
any situation.
That's right.
Always,
That's
it's
right.
so important,
That's
so.
Okay,
Okay.
All right.
thank you.
Thank you. I'm gonna look to Pam. This is Pam English, is our administrative
Hi, Pam.
director.
Hi, Governor, thank you for being here.
I'm glad to be. Thank you.
I've had the privilege of managing the programs that you've heard about here
Mhm.
for the last 26 years. And the American Victim Assistance Program is just a wonderful program that I've always felt close to. But my maternal grandmother, Jessie, became a single mom shortly after she gave birth to my mom.
Is that right?
She was. And she was really an incredibly smart and intelligent and hardworking woman. She started out as a waitress.
Yep.
And she worked through raising her child, my mom, and her grandmother, didn't have a grandmother,
Wow.
my mom's grandmother.
Yeah.
And was able to buy a diner.
Wow.
Yeah, but in 1953, when Jessie's boyfriend beat her up pretty badly, but she wasn't gonna have any of that, so she went to court when there weren't any advocates, gathered the courage to get a restraining order. Shortly after that, within
In
days,
1953.
1953, within days of that, he broke into her bedroom one night and shot her, killed her, and then killed himself. Yeah. So today in 2020, still, there's 3 women killed by intimate partners across the country every day. And here in New Hampshire, the rate of domestic homicide is high. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think you could do in terms of making inroads to stop this ongoing tragedy of domestic violence?
Well, you know, I was thinking while listening to Amanda and Natalie, that I was going to get at some point the list of non-negotiable demands in terms of resources. I do want to say that without knowing all of the holes that need to be plugged, it's clear that there are a lot of. It's a good structure, but it's a leaky structure because we're not capturing all of we're not meeting all of the need at some point. And I'll just mention this as a footnote. We should talk about how we simplify, because I've got to imagine that having all these different funding streams, that a little flexibility would probably be
Huge for the programs, huge for the programs.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the leadership opportunity, the opportunity to actually call attention to these issues, deal with them out in the open. I mentioned already. I guess I want to think about, and you can help me think about how you create a network that is strong enough so that before a fatality, the survivor has an escape route and knows to use it. I'm just thinking about Jessie's experience. You know, she had a restraining order, but the restraining order didn't restrain. And you hear this over and over again. And you know, you wonder whether for example, we imposed something called dangerousness hearings, where someone who owns a gun could have that gun confiscated in the context of a restraining order. So that, in other words, if you have to be asked and answered those questions. If you are Jessie in court getting your restraining order, and then the police are authorized to go get that weapon until a period has passed, and the local police have the authority to determine whether the temperature has cooled down some. That may be a part of it, and might have happened in Jessie's case, but that's the sort of thing that comes to mind. Tell me how you.
Lethality assessment program.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what we have here.
Yeah.
We have the lethality assessment program, which is based on the danger assessment that was created by Jackie Campbell in Maryland,
Yeah.
where police officers, when they're called to a scene and determine that it was a domestic violence and that they know who the victim is, they will sit down and go through a 12 or 13
It's 13.
It's 13 now, questions.
Including whether there's a weapon.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Or if you've ever been threatened by a weapon.
Have you been
Yes.
threatened?
Yes.
All of these things that came out of Jackie Campbell's assessment, because what she realized, the study that was done, realized that only 2% of the homicide victims ever were in contact with a local domestic violence program. So that that anyone who is in contact with a crisis program reduces the level of possible lethality.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we see with the lethalities in the state, is that a lot of the women who are killed have never had contact with a crisis center.
Yeah.
And it's so when the police determine through this assessment that this person is in danger, and if their gut tells them, even if the person doesn't screen in with the assessment, if they feel that, they get an advocate on the phone right then and there to talk to the person. Even if it's just to do a safety plan and to say, we're here if you wanna come and talk to us, or you want us to call you tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
So it gets them linked up right away.
Yeah.
It's not a mandate though. It's one of those things that our Attorney General says, we'd really like you to do this, we highly suggest, but it's not mandated, so it's not something that happens throughout
there
the
was a
state.
threshold where it's mandated, and we could actually confiscate the weapon.
Yes.
And by the way, even Goal, which is the NRA affiliate, signed on.
Yep.
Which was no small thing.
No.
But they did. There was an argument about, well, when do you get it back, and does it have, do we set an amount of time?
Yeah.
And we actually won that point too, because it's gonna vary from situation to situation. But if the interaction is between the survivor and the police alone, and the survivor answers the equivalent of that question and you were 13, then the police can go find
Yes.
the abuser and identify where the weapon or weapons are and seize them.
And I think that happens here as part of the restraining order,
It does.
if the judge says to include it in the restraining order, and that may vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
Is that helpful? Is that,
Yes,
what's missing?
Well, I think we touched on that.
Amanda, you could, yeah.
And I think adequate resources to make sure there's adequate staffing at the crisis centers when that connection is made, because there's an evidence basis behind this tool and behind this protocol. It definitely works. That early intervention is super helpful, but there need to be enough people at the crisis centers who already rely very heavily on volunteers and doing a lot of this work anyway. So I think, we keep coming back to, we know the individual cost to a single domestic violence victim, if it's a female victim, is over $100,000 a year. For a male victim, it's over $23,000 a year. The more that we can move upstream and not be incurring those costs and not have individuals incurring those costs, the better off we are. So I think we have time for one last question. I'm looking at Paula. Would you like to introduce yourself and ask the government question?
Yes, good morning, Governor. Thank you for being here.
That's
I'm Paula Check-Lemries, and I'm a survivor. And my question for you today has to do with victims. You have taken some very public stands in support of people who have been convicted of sexual assault. My question is, how do you believe the criminal legal system should balance the rights of crime victims against those of the offenders?
It's a hard question to answer in the abstract, because it's all about balance. I think that it concerns me that in the case of sexual assault and domestic violence, the victim is often not believed, and while as a lawyer, well trained I believe intensely in the in guilt until, innocence until proven guilty, because frequently if you aren't strict about that, people like me tend to get we don't benefit from the doubt, I guess is what I want to say. But there seems to me there ought to be more framework in the case of an accusation that gets the accuser out of harm's way until that ultimate question is resolved in a court. It kind of goes back to the adequacy of the network, and whether people know that there is a safe way out. Because I think that it's got to be the case. And somebody mentioned that people, maybe it was you, Natalie, that they sometimes stay in their homes because they're because they don't, bless you, they don't see an alternative. I think sometimes people they keep their accusation to themselves because they're afraid that if they speak up and they aren't believed, they may just make a terrible situation even worse. Does that make any sense?
A little.
Yeah.
Part of the problem, I think, is that the victim doesn't have enough of a voice in the court.
Yeah.
That the prosecutor or attorney is representing the state.
Yeah.
And a lot of the backstory never gets considered.
Well, so to that point, now maybe I understand your question a little bit better. I will say I think from a system point of view, and then from my sister's own experience, the victim advocate was brilliant, and the training, the professionalism, the advocacy. Really, that part of the title was very clear in her experience, and the way she worked really hard to make sure that there were opportunities for my sister to tell her whole story. Not just prepare for the defense, but to tell her whole story. I think turns out to have been incredibly meaningful for her. And Diane was my wife was one of the people who I know worked very hard with Jane Doe to make sure that their training model, which was voluntary, was made a part of the mandate for court personnel, which included victim witness advocates. So in that respect, I think that's a tangible thing.
Yeah. Not consistent though.
Well, the model now, as a result of I'm just talking about Massachusetts, is consistent across the Commonwealth. That was one of the reasons why mandatory training was in the bill, and then the model used is the Jane Doe model. So I should say it's meant to be consistent. There's a mechanism to drive consistency. What I don't know, as I sit here, is whether there have been subsequent evaluations going back now with a few years of practice to get some sense about how well it's doing. And I just don't know that as I sit here. There may have been, I just don't know that, but certainly, that is a way to try to make sure that there's consistent high quality.
Another loophole that I see is a lot of the judges are not trauma informed.
That's right.
And I, as a survivor, would like to see it that they have mandatory annual education on trauma.
Yeah, but that was in our bill. So,
good.
I don't want to give the impression that my intention as president is just to take everything we did in Massachusetts and nationalize it. But we learned a lot.
Yeah.
And I guess I want to, since it sounds like we're wrapping, I want to say one other thing that I learned, and I want you to understand about my leadership, is that I'm always listening. I am looking for new voices. I am looking for input. There's not a single personal or public decision I've ever made that couldn't have been better or wasn't made better by drawing in others and asking. It's not that I'm indecisive, I'm quite decisive, but I want change that lasts.
Yes.
I'm not interested in overinflating the performance art of these jobs,
Yeah.
but making sure the substance is real. So I don't have all of the parts that you may be looking for, but before we do anything at the national level, you need to be assured that I'll be listening for you and others before
Thank you very much.
we do what we need to do.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you for this rich dialogue. I know one of the things we will be excited to continue to talk about is even where crime victim rights fall in state statutes and state constitutions, and really looking at kind of the tools that are available to not just prosecutors and defense attorneys, but to victims and their attorneys to ensure that victims have notice, have an opportunity to be present, and have an opportunity to be heard in a meaningful way in the criminal justice process. So it seems like we'll have to save that for a future day, but I just want to say thank you so much. I don't know if you have any closing words you want to share?
Well, I noticed that a bunch of people had little pieces of paper like you did, which, does that mean you had questions that you were going
It's up to you. It's your. I'm looking
Because
to
if
why.
you
You want to keep going?
No, what I was going to say is we could also take the questions and come
Okay.
back to you
Great.
with answers if we don't have time to talk about them now. Would that be useful?
Love that. That'd be wonderful.
Okay.
That'd be great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was
Good to
great
meet
to
you.
have you.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
And thanks for your service. Thank you for your service.
Do you want to push